and welcome to the presentation. We are excited to have you here as part of our Pathlock Innovation Series. Our session right now is how to de-risk your S/4HANA migration strategy. Our presenter is Steve Apel, Director at Protiviti.
Thank you, Stephanie. Stephanie mentioned, my name is Steve Apel. I'm a director with Protiviti in our SAP Solutions team based in Dallas. I've been with Protiviti for over 15 years working in the SAP space. So lots of experience working in both ECC and S4, as well as recently helping some of our clients out with the transition migration from ECC to S4. So really happy to be with everyone here today. So quick plug for Protiviti. We are a global consulting firm with over $2 billion in revenue across 85 offices with 7,000 professionals. And we serve 35% of the global 500, global Fortune 500. And from an SAP perspective, we're a 19-year SAP Gold partner with over 600 SAP clients and over 15 global delivery centers. And we provide full implementation services, managed services, strategy and advisory services, and are a licensed SAP software reseller. So moving into the presentation, so the topics we'll plan to cover in this session, the key elements to help de-risk your SAP S/4HANA migration strategy from ECC, when to begin planning your migration strategy, we'll talk about migration and deployment options, and then we'll talk about identifying essential work streams to address before you kick off the migration. And that's really the focus here today. We're really going to talk about the pre-work, what you should do to help plan before you actually start the migration program. So the first topic that we'll get into will be key elements to help de-risk your SAP S/4HANA migration strategy. So we'll talk about clearly defining the migration strategy before you initiate the move to S/4HANA. We'll talk about the business transformation versus the technical migration options. We'll talk about the key to establishing strong executive sponsorship in the program. We'll talk about assessing competing projects and business initiatives that might be going on in parallel. And we'll talk about developing a comprehensive resource plan. So one of the first key decisions when thinking about an S4 migration is if you need a technical migration versus a full business transformation. So on the graph on the screen, we have technical migration on the left, which typically contains less risk, has less impact on change to the organization, and can be achieved in a shorter time frame. So let's talk about some factors that would lead you to choose a technical migration. Your business environment is stable and you're happy with the ECC system and processes today, meaning there isn't anything driving the real need for change. Another option is to complete the technical migration up front, which will then allow you to pick and choose specific modules or processes that you want to optimize post-migration at your own pace. On the other side is full business transformation, which carries with it increased risk, increased change impact, and increased time frame. So considering those things, why might you choose that path? You might choose that path to eliminate technical debt that you've accumulated that you don't want to carry forward into S4. Perfect opportunity to eliminate some of that technical debt. Another is to simplify and get to that clean core. So you'll hear clean core a lot from SAP. This gives you that opportunity to get to that clean core by removing customizations that you have in ECC today that don't really benefit the organization. And other areas include taking advantage of new S4 capabilities or to simply address the fact that the current ECC system no longer supports the business model, which perhaps changed over time since you implemented ECC. The next key element to establish strong executive sponsorship. it becomes really key to have someone touting the importance of the S4 migration and how it's going to benefit the business. In other words, you want somebody pushing the message that it's not simply an IT project. Who that sponsor is going to vary by organization. But where we've seen this work most successfully is with someone who can be seen as the voice of the project. And typically, or ideally, this is someone who can see the big picture needs of the organization and how S4 will benefit the entire organization and can put those needs above their own department or function's goals. Next, the next step is to establish communication channels and a cadence so that that sponsor can provide a consistent drumbeat regarding project goals, objectives, and next steps, and communicate that to the larger business community. Also important is to establish a program governance structure that can support that project sponsor and to make sure that they are kept up to date on all key decisions, any risks, and the overall project status. Along with the governance structure, it's important to establish the right meeting cadence to make sure key decision points are being escalated as appropriate, to make sure that the sponsor and executive team remain engaged, and so that they can remove any obstacles that may come up during the project. And we'll get into governance in even more detail later in the discussion. Another element that's important to address in the early stages are any competing projects or other priorities. So think about things like business expansion, mergers and acquisitions, restructuring. Look to understand what projects are ongoing and others that are planned to be kicked off, and then understand how those projects might impact an S4 migration. Once you have that list, spend some time to prioritize those projects and properly sequence them in relation to the S4 migration. Determine which project has the most priority, and then pull forward or delay projects as needed, so it gives some runway to the S4 migration. Where it's determined that multiple projects will be going in parallel, it's important to understand resource allocation. Especially where people will be expected to wear multiple hats, look to understand whether that's truly feasible for those people. Also think about the organizational impact from other projects and whether the S4 migration will be more transformational in nature, as we talked about earlier. In other words, think about how much change the organization can take on at once and still execute each of those projects effectively. One area we have seen really help in this regard is to establish an overarching integrated PMO across these projects. This office can then have visibility across projects, raise risks as needed, and help to address any conflicts as early as possible. And ultimately, all of this is to help raise the likelihood of overall project success. The next key element to address is developing the resource plan up front. This plan needs to consider both business as usual activities, as well as the activities within the migration project, as well as any other parallel projects that might be going on that we just talked about. Far too often, we've seen the scenario play out as depicted on the left, which is to rely solely on resources on hand. What happens is that your key resources end up being pulled in multiple directions, requiring a lot of long working hours. And when you consider these migration projects can last a year at minimum, you start to see burnout, project delays, rework, and even attrition. A more successful approach relies on understanding the project plan and times of peak demand. It also relies on understanding your critical resources within the business and the skills required to execute on the migration. Think about where you have gaps and how to address those skill gaps, whether that's to hire new people, buy those skills through specialized contractors and consultants, or upskilling the resources you have. You want to make all those decisions up front as part of your planning process. An option we've seen success with is to backfill some of your business as usual roles to allow for your skilled internal resources to participate in the migration project. This helps ensure key business requirements are met as part of the project, but the other key factor is that the internal resource participation in the project will help increase user adoption after go live. You want to make sure your your user community feels engaged and are part of the decision-making process with the project itself. So our next topic is going to be migration and deployment options. So we'll talk a little bit about timing considerations for the project. We'll look at things like greenfield versus brownfield versus select data transitions. And then we'll talk a little bit about on-premise versus RISE scenarios. So a key consideration is the 2027 deadline for mainstream maintenance of ECC from SAP. After 2027, there will be some other options for maintenance, for support, including extended maintenance from SAP, which will come at a higher price, but even that has a deadline of 2030. Some of the statistics we have seen show over 65% of SAP customers on ECC have yet to purchase the S4 license, which accounts for over 20,000 customers. So that's another consideration as we get closer to the deadline. The demand for skilled integration partners will start to go up quickly. So factor that into your planning. When you think about the deadline, you can work backwards, thinking through not only the actual migration timeline, but also all of the pre-work activity that will be needed to help you determine when to get started. To help with all of this, consider bringing in third-party experts who have previously led S4 migrations and can help think through all the potential pitfalls and establish a roadmap that includes all the necessary pre-work activities to de-risk the project. And then start thinking through all of the elements we've already discussed, including governance, resource plans, and communication plans. So factoring all that in, there's a lot to do, and 2027 will come up fast. So in summary, start that process now. The next consideration is your migration path. The main options are greenfield, or basically starting with a fresh implementation, brownfield, which is more in line with the technical conversion, and selective data transition, or sometimes called bluefield, which is a combination of greenfield and brownfield. What are some of the factors that will lead you to choose greenfield? This is akin to some of the same business transformation elements we talked through earlier, including a highly customized current environment that you want to simplify, potentially a very old version of SAP, which doesn't have a clear migration path to S4, consolidating multiple instances or business units, significant changes happening within the business, and more of a tolerance to risk from the business. When thinking about brownfield on the left, this is more akin to a technical migration with similar elements, including an ECC environment your company is pretty happy with. So why change? Customizations that may exist in ECC today, but should remain because they're differentiating processes for your business. Perhaps minimal changes that have happened in your business over time. and a relatively low risk tolerance from your organization. Not depicted here is a brownfield plus scenario, which includes a technical migration while extending functionality into new business processes. And then talking a little bit about selective data transition. This approach tends to be more complex than either of the others here and raises the risk. A well thought out strategy is crucial if you decide to go this route. An example of when to use selective data transition includes when you need to spin out a business unit out of ECC as you go through the S4 migration. This example requires removal of old or stale data and configuration, which presents challenges and requires a fair bit of extra testing along the way. Our recommendation is only to go this route when absolutely necessary. And I'll touch quickly on deployment models. On the left, you have traditional on-premise or any premise utilizing hyperscaler infrastructure. And on the right, you have a depiction of the RISE program from SAP. The main aspect with RISE is that you're paying one subscription price for hyperscaler infrastructure, software licensing, and technical services which are provided by SAP. And then note that application layer services remain with you as the customer under the RISE program. Key things to consider here are to be sure you fully understand the SLAs provided by SAP under RISE and any upcharges that come along with increasing those SLAs. Control of the system, cost elements, and technical service capabilities are the main factors that you want to consider when going to RISE. From a control of the system perspective, do you need flexibility to do things on demand, like perform a client copy? Or are you okay to schedule these with SAP, understanding there is potential for some delay? From a cost perspective, consider how much disaster recovery and high availability you need, and be sure to budget for extras not in your agreement under RISE. The next section we'll talk about is identifying essential work streams that need to be addressed before you kick off the migration. We'll talk about the phase 0 framework. We'll talk more detail about project governance. We'll talk organizational change management. We'll look at mandatory change impact that happens when you move from ECC to S4HANA. We'll talk about data quality and remediation. And then we'll talk about application security and controls. So shown here are what we consider to be the key elements of a migration strategy, or what we've referred to as a phase 0 effort. Each of these elements are elements that need to be planned for and addressed during pre-migration. When we think about process, what's important is to understand where we should optimize existing processes and where we should keep our processes as is. We'll talk about process a little later in the presentation. Data. An assessment of data quality and understanding what sort of remediation effort is needed prior to migration kickoff is critical. We'll talk more on data soon as well. And when we talk about solution design, we're thinking about which applications are needed to enable those future processes. So this includes any third-party apps you have today, and thinking through which of those third-party apps should be migrated over to S4 functionality, and which apps should remain in your landscape, in which case integration strategy must also be considered. There are also other considerations to address, such as your analytics strategy and your application security and control strategy. Deployment strategy we have touched on a bit already. Key here is roadmap development, including phasing. How many go lives do we need? And do we factor in functionality and processes in each go live? Or do we consider business unit and geography, or some combination of each of those to help determine what our phasing might look like for go live? And finally, business case development is something that most executive teams are going to want to understand. Clearly, costs come into play here. But what are the expected benefits of the S4 migration, and how are we going to measure those KPIs? Are items that should be discussed and agreed upon upfront with the executive team so that there are no surprises later on. Next, we wanted to give an example of the phase 0 elements that we worked on for one of our Protiviti clients, who is a $10 billion plus services provider. Each of these sections have largely been discussed already, and this list is going to be fairly standard for each company. However, what we want to highlight here is that this list is tailorable based on specific needs. Security and controls, for example, is not always included in phase 0, but was a specific area that needed to be addressed for this client. Within each of these elements, though, we establish budgetary estimates, not only for the pre-work, but also estimates for what could be expected during the actual S4 migration. This information was then fed into the business case, which could then be taken to executive leadership for project approval. Here we wanted to dive a little further into program governance, as it's truly key to a successful migration. We advocate for establishing this framework well before the actual migration begins. This allows participants to get used to the cadence and their roles within governance, and so that any issues and adjustments can be worked out before the actual migration starts. So going around the wheel from the top, you have the PMO with an overall program manager who's responsible for making sure the other elements are working as expected. It's a key role. Moving clockwise, governance structures, to me, is maybe the most important element in this structure. You want to be sure to have the right people who can make the right decisions as quickly as possible. So here you define who participates within each level or group within the organizational hierarchy. The goal is to empower each group to make decisions in specific situations and to define when they should be escalating to the next group in the hierarchy based on established guardrails. This is where you want to define those groups as well as what those decision-making guardrails should be. Understanding you will have the opportunity to change the specifics as you go through the project to tailor as needed based on how your company best operates. Continuing on, we have program plan validation. The goal here is to have an all-encompassing plan with dependencies across all parties, including the business, internal IT, system integrators, and other third parties. Real-time decision-making is about making sure the escalation path is well understood and that an appropriate cadence has been established for when each governance group should meet, which may vary based on the stage in the program. True status communication is just as it is stated. You want an honest view of where things stand across all parties in the organization so that blockers can be identified and addressed as early as possible. And finally, continuous risk monitoring is about defining what methodology is going to be used, including scorecards, risk ownership, and an approach to assessing current risk levels. Next, we'll talk a little bit about change management, which is another key factor that should be thought about early in the program and is more than simply providing training prior to go live. Effective change management will lead to increased user adoption, increased project success, reduced project risk, and decreased time to market. All good things. The level of investment in change enablement will be driven by the migration approach. In other words, more change activity is needed for greenfield and business transformations as opposed to technical conversions. As depicted here, there should be change management activities across all phases of the program. When thinking about pre-work or phase 0 specifically, the key elements include understanding change readiness, developing strategic communications, alignment of executives to the program approach, and mapping stakeholders to specific project roles. And the change management tasks will change as you proceed into different phases of the project, as shown on the slide here. Next, we'll consider process impact and mandatory changes introduced by S4. The mandatory changes are typically in the finance area and include things like the Universal Journal and changes to how credit checking works. It's important to consider how these changes will impact existing processes. This is important to consider, especially for a technical conversion. There will be some amount of changes that are unavoidable with S4, and these should be identified and planned for during your pre-work. The S4 project also provides a great opportunity to review your application landscape to see if existing solutions and functionality can be folded into S4HANA to simplify your integration strategy. The roadmap that is developed should also consider sequencing. What needs to be part of an initial migration and what functionality can wait for a subsequent phase. Those optimization opportunities should be inventoried for later consideration. And finally, this is a great opportunity to establish your Fiori strategy. Fiori provides a better user experience, but also introduces another degree of change to end users, as well as your SAP support personnel. Some considerations include whether you'll move to an all Fiori approach or a hybrid approach between Fiori and traditional GUI. In either case, this decision will impact the program plan as well as training requirements, so establish the plan early on. Next, let's look at data. Basically, you can never start data cleanup early enough. So I'll repeat that. You can never start data cleanup early enough. Data is a typical area that is underestimated on these programs and a leading cause of cost overruns and project delays. Therefore, assess the state of your data early on and understand where you're starting from and how you plan to fix any data issues that are identified. Data archiving is an important consideration in the process. How much data do you need to move over to S4 and why? Part of the consideration is that HANA storage is expensive. So if data is not needed in real time within S4HANA, it should be archived before the migration. And think about less costly storage options that allow you to retrieve the data, but only store the data according to your data retention policies. This also represents a tieback to resource planning that we discussed earlier. Here you want to think about the number of resources and skills that are needed, including for roles like data owner, data cleansing, and data transformation. So I'll just reiterate it again. Start the data work stream in the earliest phases of pre-work. And as mentioned earlier, application security and controls is an area that not every company will need to address, but if you're having audit challenges or general issues with users requesting and approving the correct access in line with job functions, then now is a good time to address. If you plan to redesign security, then this can be done as part of pre-work, or it can be done in parallel to the S4 migration, considering potential changes to processes and introduction of Fiori. Part of the redesign of security should include the deployment of access governance processes, including via the use of automation from tools offered by Pathlock. Governance will be key to keeping the new security environment clean in the long term, and Pathlock tools allow you to monitor in real time and automate your control environment. Along with security, the migration brings a great opportunity to design in automated controls, which can be baked into the S4 configurations. Work in concert with your compliance and audit partners to be sure that the control design is effective and properly documented to ease the burden of audit testing by minimizing the use of manual controls to the extent possible. And that takes us to the end of the webinar with a few key points I'll leave you with to take home. Start developing your strategy soon, and certainly well before you think the migration will need to actually start. Develop your strategy considering key elements including process impact, data, solution design, deployment approach, and business case. Don't rush through the pre-work and plan for the unexpected. And saying it for probably the fourth time, don't underestimate your data needs. Let your strategy development dictate what degree of transformation is needed for your organization, and kick off project governance before the migration begins to allow for tailoring as needed. And finally, bring in partners to support you at the right levels with the right expertise, as it's an important initiative and one you don't want to get wrong. So starting with a good strategy and a good plan up front is the best way to go. And that concludes the presentation. I appreciate the time, and I think we'll pause here for a few minutes of Q&A.
Thank you so much, Steve, for your presentation. Again, if you do have any questions, we encourage you now to add them into our questions box on the control panel. Our first question is, do you expect SAP to hold firm with the 2007 date for ending ECC support, or will they push the date back again?
Yeah, that's a question we get quite a bit. So, I think originally the deadline they gave was 2025 for ending ECC support, mainstream support. I think that kind of quickly got pushed back to 2027. But at this point, all the conversations we've had with SAP, I don't think there's any indication that that date is going to shift again. I don't think they want to set that precedent that they're going to just continually shift that date backwards. So I would definitely expect that 2027 date to hold firm. And so, like we said, it's basically 3 years at this point, and that will come by very fast. The actual migration, you're probably looking at a year long at minimum, depending on the size and complexity of your organization. So there's a lot of planning and pre-work that needs to go into it. So that's why we're really pushing, start now. You'll probably, as you go through that planning, uncover a lot of unexpected potential hurdles, challenges that you'll need to address in the migration. So the earlier you understand that, the better. And like I said, I really think as you get closer to 2027, the best resources that are out there, the best partners, the best contractors with specialized skills, that demand is just going to go up and the availability of those people are going to go down. So it's just another reason to start early.
Okay, great. We had another question come in that says, can you talk about considerations for business processes that are supported by significant custom code in the current SAP implementation?
Yeah, so I guess if the question is related to you want to keep that custom code and you want to move that into S4, there are different third parties that are out there, including Protiviti, but others as well, who have established basically tools that will assess the current code and basically do that code transformation for you into S4. So there's a lot of analysis that goes into that. There is SAP has a tool that you can find on their website that basically you can put onto your SAP system. It's essentially a program, and will do a bunch of checks and tell you, how much custom code you have out there. What are some of the red flags that you need to address as part of a migration? What are some things that will convert easily? What are other things that are going to need some manual efforts outside of a sort of traditional conversion? So that's probably your best starting point, is to go to SAP, get that migration tool, the migration checker. I'm blanking on the actual name of the tool, but it's out there on SAP. And it runs fairly quickly on your environment and will spit out a pretty good report telling you, how much customization you have and how to go, what's going to convert easily and what's going to probably take a bit more effort. So hopefully I was answering the question.
Yeah, so I think that's all the questions we have for right now. But if you do have any more questions, you can reach out to Steve at steven.apel@protiviti.com. It's right there on the screen. Or us here at Pathlock at info@pathlock.com, and we'd be happy to answer any of your questions. Again, we have another session coming up here next. It's going to be our roundtable discussion, how undetected application risk can threaten your organization's compliance and how to address it. The link is in the chat if you would like to join that session, and we hope to see you at future events. Thank you, Steve.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.